Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Iran. In a region where it's all about influence, Iran seems to have a lot. But how is it fighting or supporting groups in Iraq, Syria and Yemen, and managing to pay for it all? Also this week, Hong Kong's property lottery. There's a chronic housing and land shortage. So where do you build next? And what impact will it have on Hong Kong's ever-shrinking environment? And China's checkbook diplomacy. Europe's on board with its new development bank, but the United States is out in the cold. So we're looking at Iran this week, but nothing to do with its nuclear program or the ongoing nuclear talks in Switzerland. Instead, our buzzword is influence, because it would appear Iran is increasing its military presence in the Middle East, raising a lot of questions about just what its ambitions are. So we thought we'd have a look at what Iran is actually capable of deploying, even as it deals with economic sanctions. Inevitably, as with most such issues, it does come down to money. For this financial year, starting March 15, Tehran has set aside a budget of $312 billion, up 6% on last year. Defence expenditure is expected to rise by a third to around $10 billion, the bulk of which will go to the elite Revolutionary Guards. They get more than $6 billion. But let's not forget, Iran's economy has shrunk 8.6% in the past 2 fiscal years. In fact, Iran's oil minister has said the fall in oil exports was costing his country $8 billion a month. So what support is Tehran offering its neighbours? Well, in Iraq, you've got the Quds Force, which is fighting alongside Shia Iraqi militias and the Iraqi army. The head of Iraq's Parliamentary Security and Defence Committee, Shahwan Abdullah, told Al Jazeera there are 30,000 soldiers and advisors operating in a number of Iraqi cities. Top of these advisors is this man, Major General Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Tehran's Al-Quds Force. He's been instrumental in the ongoing offensive in Tikrit and other key battles against ISIL, although the New York Times says he has now left the area after the US said airstrikes were conditional on Iraqi forces taking a leading role. And then last July, 7 Su-25 Frogfoot attack planes were deployed by Iran to the Imam Ali Air Base in Iraq. The delivery of these aircraft provided the first evidence of direct military aid. So that's Iraq. Over the border in Syria, you've got Iran supporting the Syrian government, really. It's estimated up to 10,000 Iranian operatives are in Syria, and that support's come with $15 billion in financial aid. That's what Syria's Minister of Finance and Economy, Ibrahim Miro, said last year. Got to think about Hezbollah too, over in Lebanon, the group backed by Iran, which announced back in May of 2013 it was fighting in Syria alongside the Assad regime. It's estimated to have around 4,000 to 5,000 fighters on the ground. Hezbollah's fighting alongside the IRGC, this is the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, as well as ground forces, Al-Quds Force and Iranian intelligence services. And finally, Yemen, of course. The Houthis, backed by Iran, have taken over many cities, including the capital, Sana'a. Tehran smuggled AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades, surface-to-air missiles, C4 explosives, all these things, according to the New York Times. Also provided economic aid. It signed agreements to expand ports, supply electricity and oil. There's an aviation agreement which saw the first Tehran to Sana'a flight arrive in March. But the Houthis' advance on Aden, unsurprisingly, has drawn in a Saudi-led coalition which bombed the capital. Well, Renard Mansour is joining us now via Skype from Cambridge in the UK. He's a scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Centre to talk about what Iran is up to. Renard, the timing is even more significant now given what's happened in Yemen. It's just interesting to see Iran's influence so strong across the Middle East, increasing that military budget. But you have to ask, where does it get all this money from to finance it?
Well, you're right. There's been an increase in Iran's military budget, roughly over 30% in the last year. And first of all, I think it's important to kind of understand why that is. What's happening in the region, especially on the borders of Iran in the last year or so, there's clearly a need to increase its budget. And the biggest example is Iran's involvement in Iraq right now. Whereas Iran used to rely on unconventional and asymmetrical ways of funding proxies in the region, it is very much controlling another army in the sense that, at least in a de facto sense, that the Iraqi Ministry of Interior is very much under, at some form of Iranian control. So, and the Shia militias that are trying to fight against the so-called Islamic State are, in coordination with Iran. You see Qasem Soleimani the leader of the Quds force, the Iranian force, on the ground. So it needs to sort of up its defense spending because this is a different type of game that it's playing in the last year or so. Now, where it's planning to get the money from, there is a lot of optimism in its budget. First of all, I mean, it's counting for an oil price around $72 a barrel, which we know at the moment is not there yet. However, I think with why negotiations have become very important for Iran. I think the Iranian government is hoping that through negotiations it can get some more compromises to how much it's allowed to export, as well as how much of frozen assets it's allowed to then begin to take advantage of. But more technically, where it's planning to get money from is from, first of all, increasing taxes for former actors, big conglomerates that never used to pay taxes, notably big construction workers linked to the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, as well as maybe some of the religious trusts, trying to increase taxes there.
OK, can I go back to the point you made about the $70 a barrel for oil, which is what you said Iran is budgeting for? It may not get that. It certainly hasn't been getting that for a while now, and we don't know what the oil recovery will look like if it indeed happens. So again, I go back to my original question about how Iran can finance all of this when its revenue stream isn't really assured.
Right, and you're right to question this, and many people are questioning this. They've kept it there, and that's one of their forms of optimism, but they do have contingencies in plan in case the price of oil doesn't reach there. So as I was mentioning, they're decreasing, for example, some of the state salaries. They're bringing it down to about 17% of the budget, and they're finding other ways to try and get money because there is a very real chance, and you're completely right, that the price of oil won't go back to $70 or $72, which is what they've budgeted for.
Is there also a risk, Renard, of the Saudis trying to push that oil price down further? Because they could handle that, but if they push it down, it would punish Iran, which arguably can't handle it.
Yeah, and that's right. And actually, if you listen to what's being said on the streets in Iran, there's a lot of conspiracies and a lot of anti-Saudi messaging going on, saying that Saudi Arabia is driving the price of oil down to hurt Iran. And so as these sort of regional tensions become more inflamed, as you said initially with what's going on in Yemen at the moment, I think that's very much that's very much a soft power, I suppose, tactic that Saudi Arabia is playing to hurt Iran and others as well. However, it's hard to see the price going, much lower than it is, even for Saudi's sake at the moment. I think a lot of experts would agree with that.
OK, let's float in the idea of the United States here, which has this uncomfortable relationship with Iran in Iraq in the fight against ISIL. But there's Syria as well, and the US said it'll have to talk to Bashar al-Assad at some point. How does all of this sort of come together? In fact, does it come together?
Right. Well, I think what we're beginning to see, or at least become aware of, is that there have been ongoing negotiations between Washington and Tehran for many years now. And I think Syria is a consequence of that. So that all the complications of what's going on in Syria and all the injustices and humanitarian issues is because Syria was very much one of the bargaining chips that no one really wanted to play with because of these negotiations. And if you look at rhetoric coming out of, for example, Israel or Saudi Arabia, there is very much fear of what they perceive President Obama is serving as his legacy, which would be to be the president perhaps that could kind of improve relations with Iran. And I think that's based on a realization from the U.S. that a lot of their mistakes in Iraq have perhaps been due to perhaps a fundamental misunderstanding of Iran and Iranian interests, coupled with chances in certain instances, for example, in Iraq, where both of their interests align and converge.
That is Renard Mansour talking Iran with us this week. Renard, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, the machine that creates water out of thin air, using technology from nature to help ease the world's clean water problems. That is coming up a little later. We'll look at Hong Kong now, though, and really just this image alone in our video wall really does illustrate our point this week perfectly. Skyscrapers, lots of them, building upwards because land is scarce and it's tough to have your own house. And so private developers are now eyeing the city's open spaces to meet the growing demand. You can only imagine what the environmental groups think about that. Rob McBride has more.
It is house hunting Hong Kong style. A lucky draw for hopeful owners of the latest development. For the winners, the chance to buy a 40 square metre unit for about $1 million in a block that hasn't been completed yet. Hong Kong is relying heavily on private developers to meet its target of 500,000 new flats in the next 10 years.
Current government has planned to increase the supply, so there will be sufficient supply on the stream already.
The question is where to build. Environmentalists fear Hong Kong's country parks, until now free from development, will suffer.
This we belong to the whole Hong Kong people. It does not belong to the small group of land developer, because they're a short sight. Just only to earn the short money and destroy the environment.
Already home to Hong Kong's airport, which is about to get its third runway, and to its adjoining new town currently being expanded, Lantau Island is seen as a prime target for development. And that's before the government has exploited redevelopment options in existing urban areas, according to green groups.
Still now the government is having the new town planning, like we need a massive, large piece of empty land for you to do everything, start from zero.
The government is well aware that any talk of building in Hong Kong's green spaces is highly inflammatory, but it has to balance that with the pressing need for new homes in a city which is facing a housing crisis. Kent Lam and his wife Mancy got married just 2 weeks ago. Both are working professionals and have been saving for several years, but have no choice but to move in with her parents in their small apartment.
All we can do is go on saving, but I have no idea how long it will be before we would have enough to buy our own place.
Like many of their generation, it will still be many years before they have the down payment even to enter a draw for a flat. McBride, Al Jazeera, Hong Kong.
We'll stay with China now in what looks like the ultimate geopolitical power play, China versus the United States. Now, the latter already knows this is big. The Treasury Secretary Jack Lew said, quote, "The United States' international credibility and influence," end quote, has come under threat. But it got worse when, over the past 2 weeks, Western nations effectively broke ranks with the US and asked to join China's new infrastructure bank. This is the $50 billion AIIB, that is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It'll come into existence at the end of March. It was actually Britain which was the first Western nation to seek founding member status. It's being formed because China's long wanted a bigger voice at the IMF and the World Bank and regional investment banks, but has been blocked by the US Congress. And Beijing's not stopping there either. It's also behind this, what will effectively be a BRICS bank. It's actually called the New Development Bank, but it's backed by Brazil and Russia and India. We should point out, though, the AIIB is unlikely to be a direct competitor to the World Bank or the Asia Development Bank, because the World Bank, for example, has a mandate to end extreme poverty by decreasing the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day. But the AIIB, by contrast, will focus solely on infrastructure. Well, we're going to talk to Professor Jeff Kingston about all of this now. He's joining us via Skype from Tokyo. He is the Director of Asian Studies at Temple University. Jeff, can I start with a quote for you first? It is from China's official news agency, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it talks about a decisive crack in the anti-AIIB front forged by America. Sour grapes over the AIIB makes America look isolated and hypocritical. Now, that is strong rhetoric, yes, but does it actually hold water? Has the US ceded some of its global financial grip by opposing China so much?
Well, I mean, it's been bumbling diplomacy from the get-go. I mean, this was not a fight worth picking. Obviously, given Asia's limitless needs for infrastructure, it makes sense for China to pitch in with its new development bank. And Washington could, from the beginning, have cooperated. What's happened is America has looked weak and inept in conducting this diplomacy. And one by one, all of America's close allies have jumped on board the China Express, leaving America looking rather isolated. Only Japan really is the only country that doesn't look like it's going to throw its hat in the ring. And America has been petulant about this, right? I mean, they criticized London and, made comparisons to Neville Chamberlain's appeasement policy towards Hitler, call accommodating China is not the best way to conduct diplomacy. And America's, expressed this great shock that all of its allies think that it's in their interest, economic interest, to jump on board, and greed has trumped principle. This is shocking stuff for America, and obviously America is looking like it's got pie in the face. Why did it stick its neck out on this policy, given that it totally makes sense, and obviously nobody was going to stick with Washington on this? Really a poor decision. And all along, China's been saying, look, we want to play a more responsible role in the IMF, in the World Bank, in the Asian Development Bank. And Washington wouldn't play ball, wouldn't give them any extra room. So the good news here is China could do this bilaterally on its own with the various nations, but it's opening up to a multilateral approach. And this is very sensible and is going to promote greater transparency and good governance. And the IMF and World Bank have indicated in the past week they're going to also cooperate with China. So I think things are going to turn out better than at first look, but Washington's looking pretty bad on all this.
Right, so the fact that Germany and France and Italy and Britain all jumped on board here, are they demonstrating good sense, do you think, realising where the money trail actually leads these days?
Well, I think that clearly London got in first because they want to be the bankers of Beijing. They think they're going to make some money. Now, of course, they're all talking about how we can work from the inside to promote good governance and transparency and sustainability. But I don't for a minute think that's their priority. But the fact that they are joining and will participate will inevitably promote greater transparency and good governance and sustainability. So I think that it, does make sense. It'd be asinine to oppose the Chinese Development Bank. For somebody like me who's traveled all over Asia, all over all their crumbling roads and their, bad bridges and terrible trains, this is really good news, and this is going to ignite Asian economies. And so it's definitely a positive development.
Yeah, slight bit of irony, though, that Europe would come in with all this money to spend on infrastructure in Asia when it's not been doing that back at home. And arguably, that would have been a good way to kickstart their own economies.
Well, China's the one that's kicking in most of the capital for this, 50 billion capital initially. So I think China is going to be carrying most of the water on this. And so the other countries will pony up, a billion or two here or there. So, I think that there's clearly needs in Europe, but Asia is the future of the world economy. This is where they have the growing populations. This is where economic growth is going to be centered here and in Africa. The Chinese have already sewn up African infrastructure projects, right? They've already, taken the march and taken this business away from Western countries. The one thing that to worry about is that most of the Chinese infrastructure that's been built in Africa is shoddy and crumbling. So you could argue that maybe America is altruistically trying to save Asia from Chinese substandard infrastructure, but I don't think that's really what they're on about. I think clearly what Washington's worried about is the rise of China and the rise of this development bank is going to diminish the influence and power of the United States in this region. And Tokyo agrees. And I think that they're both wrong. This zero-sum thinking is a dead end. Much better to cooperate and collaborate with the Chinese, improve what's going to be done, and benefit from that.
Jeff Kingston talking Asian investment with us. Jeff, thank you for your time.
Sure. Take care.
The irony of all this competition and animosity between Washington and Beijing is that China is the #1 investor in the United States. Last year alone, Beijing plowed $13 billion into the country. Tom Ackerman tells us more now.
In New York Harbor, France's gift to the U.S., the Statue of Liberty has been greeting new arrivals for more than a century. And soon, this giant observation wheel on the city's Staten Island will join that skyline, thanks in large part to 300 investors from China. It's part of a wave of development projects financed by Chinese money. In New York City, an estimated $3 billion last year alone. Chinese companies have recently acquired two city landmarks, the General Motors building and the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Chinese-financed residential housing is also under construction, like Skyview Park, attracting buyers from China itself.
I can have relatives here that live in New York but know somebody in China, and through word of mouth, they know that projects like Skyview Park exist.
The Chinese have also been stepping deeper into the American tech market. Lenovo acquiring Motorola's handset business after buying IBM's computer server division. And Chinese money is beginning to bet on new tech startups. But Chinese aren't only looking at U.S. investments for the financial return. Last year, Chinese citizens accounted for 85% of people who obtained a special class of permanent residence visas here. They're granted to foreigners who invest at least $500,000 in businesses that hire 10 or more Americans.
For a smaller restaurant, they typically just need $500,000 or $1 million. Restaurant business are typical labor-intensive business.
As China's own property market cools down and the Beijing government shows less tolerance for corruption, more investors see those visas opening the door to eventual U.S. citizenship for their families.
Many of them want to come to the United States because they're feeling insecure in their own country. Many of them simply want another passport as opposed to actually coming here and living here.
At an investment summit in Washington this week, the Chinese guests made clear that just selling their products to American consumers isn't enough. Their country holds the world's largest reserve in foreign exchange, most of it in U.S. dollars. Plentiful means to plant their own stakes in an expanding U.S. economy for years to come. Tom Ackerman, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Finally this week, water. You're supposed to drink 8 glasses of it a day. But that's a tough thing to do in, say, Latin America, where 34 million people don't have access to clean drinking water. So wouldn't it be amazing if you could just create water out of thin air? Well, Lucia Newman in Santiago found out there's no if about it.
What if they could access clean water anytime, anywhere, out of thin air? That's the promise of fresh water, a machine that does just that by extracting moisture from the air, just like a cloud.
What this machine does is form a small cloud inside that generates water. The air passes through here and we cool it. If you touch it, it's cold. The water is produced through condensation. I'll show you. Put your hand here.
It's raining on my hand. Fresh water is the brainchild of this Chilean naval engineer, an industrial designer, and a forestry engineer. Put together the prototype in this Santiago Innovation Center called Social Lab, where each startup aims to fulfill a social need.
We want everyone to have a well in their home and not depend on water currents or if it rains. People can have unlimited, infinite water supplies. Water is for everyone.
If there is no electricity, you plug the machine into a solar panel. It is self-sustainable. It consumes very little energy.
It's NASA technology simplified. The prototype produces between 9 and 30 liters of chemical and sulfur-free water a day, depending on climate conditions. It is almost 40 degrees out here. Everything is dry, as you can see, and there's practically no moisture in the air. But even in these extreme conditions, and even in the desert, we are told, the fresh water machine is able to extract moisture and produce drinking water. The only drawback right now seems to be the price, roughly $1,000. But its creators want to eventually make it more affordable. Their contribution, they say, towards quenching the global thirst for life's most basic resource. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Santiago.
And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page. It has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us. You can tweet either me at Kamal AJE. Our business editor is at Abid Oliver Ali, and you can use the hashtag AJCTC as well. Or just drop us an email. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.